California, the University of California in Berkeley, and now the University of Minnesota, had a particular catalyst that initiated its effort, but each arrived at broader philosophical and logical approaches to managing, and I have managing as kind of the catch-all word for renewing and reinventing and sustaining formal spaces for learning. Approaches that are now have become embedded in institutional practices and policies for shaping learning environments campus-wide, for giving attention to what people learn, how people learn, and where students learn. Today, the story, as you can see on your screen, is from the University of Minnesota. It's a story told from the perspective of people responsible for facilities, for research and evaluation, and for the learning of students, specifically today, a professor of biology. So join me in a moment in welcoming them, but I just want to give you the normal rules of the road for the LSC webinars. You can see the access code down there to chat. If you want to send a message to me or a question, you can send a message by clicking on all participants, and I will do that right now, and I will say, here is how to do that, and I will send it. If you have a question you'd like to ask in the middle of a conversation, our colleagues from Minnesota have established 3 or 4 times for formal question asking, but you can raise your hand and ask a question, and that's in, so there is, you can see my hand is raised now. There's a little icon below the view all attendees, and I think those are all the formal. One more formal guideline for the webinars is to please put your sound on mute or make sure that the ambient noise does not get reverberated through all the people involved with the webinar. We have 40 or 50 people on the webinar. We're pleased that we have a significant number of architects as well as academic institutions. So right now, Jeremy, Jennifer is going to toss the ball to Minnesota, and I believe it's yours.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Quick introduction, wave of the hand. Jeremy Todd, University of Minnesota. I'm joined today with?
My name is Walker. I conduct research and evaluation in the Office of Information Technology here at Minnesota.
And I'm Robin Wright, and I have the privilege of teaching in one of these wonderful rooms.
And today, we're going to highlight our work that brought us to this point in science teaching and student services, the research, the evaluation, the collaboration that took place. A little background about the building itself. There's 17 classrooms in that. There's 10 active learning classrooms. We're going to throw an acronym at you, an ALC. Each of those ALCs are divisible, so we could have 20 rooms at one time in the building. In total, if we look at our academic year of 2010 to 2011, 40% of our undergraduate students had a course in the building, and 33% had a course in an active learning classroom. What that means is our total undergraduate population is 30,000, so a third, 10,000 of those students had a course in an active learning classroom. And those numbers held true for the following academic years as well. How did we get to where we are today? Robin did a lot of work in 2006. I did a little work in 2006, reviewing our inventory of what we had. We had a lot of spaces that allowed for exposition, that had really one format into them, whether they were 16-seat rooms or a 1,000-seat classroom. So we looked then at what our partners on campus were doing and looking at space, and that's Robin. She was redesigning her curriculum to take place in that lecture hall, but we found that partnership and that community to build a space to better work for her. Then we looked at benchmarking. What was North Carolina State doing, Thiel at MIT, internationally, where were some of these student-focused rooms being developed? To give you a highlight of what we did, this is a picture of our active learning classrooms in use in STSS. This room seats 126 students. We're actually presenting from the space today, and if you can bear with us, we're going to try some marvels of technology, rotate the camera around so you can get a little bit of a view of the space.
That's cool.
And then coming back roughly. So we'll get more into how the space is used, by whom, and then Robin's really going to highlight that. To get to this point, though, we did research and evaluation. That's where Walker's going to take us through it in the middle section of our presentation today. The summary of that is that the spaces help students outperform their final grade expectations. The spaces, while faculty can try to lecture in them, they're not conducive to lecture. Little bit of time, 10 to 15 minutes, but really taking a step back and looking at how to use the space with active learning principles is better outcomes for the space. So I get to then dive into the facilities conversation. In 2006, I am the director of a department that looks at all of our general purpose classrooms on campus. We wanted to look at what we could do for building a new type of space using techniques that were used in new laboratory buildings, new office complexes. We built 2 pilot rooms, a 45-seat room in our East Bank campus, as well as a 117-seat room in our St. Paul campus. We used low-profile raised flooring for cable management. We did different monitor sizes at student stations. So tables seat 9 students, 3 groups of 3. There's a laptop connection per group of 3 students. They each have a monitor that they can control at their table and then share at the table. The instructor has the ability then to take any of the knowledge or information shared at that table on that video screen and distribute it across the room. When we look at that, we really knew that that was our strength as a department. We needed a partner on campus that could tell us the feedback from the space, and that was where Walker and his staff really stepped up for us. They did the student-led observations and evaluations. They did it with researchers as well, and that helped us build a story to look at this new building. Robin had her team, and they were really looking at the curriculum and how to use the space, and it was a better fit than trying to build that curriculum around a lecture hall. Our evaluation from that really highlighted the collaboration between the academic and the administration of instructional spaces on campus. It brought instructors and students' voices to the discussion. Their feedback helped design and build the new building. And then we really highlighted, because of the pilots were built and it was a sink or swim model, that we needed a faculty development program and support services because not everyone's going to be ready day one to jump into this space and take advantage of it and to create an environment of learning, optimal learning. For those that are interested, our ALC, our physical space size, I talked about the rooms, but dimensionally we're about 22 to 23 square feet per student in calculation. So the room we're in today is 2,800 square feet. It seats 126 students, and that's how we calculate down to the 22 to 23. And that holds true in all of our spaces in the building. The furniture shape and size is one of the questions I get frequently. We looked at our existing guidelines for classroom space and trying to provide equal amount of writing surface on the table for each student, looking at our guidelines as well for a projected image height. We wanted our students no more than 6 times the image height from their student displays, and that helped lay out the space that we're sitting in. The images shown here kind of highlight that. We have a picture of our pilot room on the upper far right, and then layouts of the existing space we are in today. The 9 students at a table is a question that we receive. We have core sections that may not use it as 3 groups of 3 students. They may use it as 2 groups of 4 students. And I support that in the sense that it provides a seat for the instructor to come to the table. And that's a neat way of how to invite someone to the table and really look at it being student-centered, student-focused. It's their table, inviting the instructor to sit with them to have the discussion and to broaden the discussion. I do want to highlight acoustics and performance when we look at space design. The new building we're in has a raised floor system that for air delivery as well as power and cable management. Looking at that and knowing that we were going to divide the space in half, We had to make sure that everything was constructed to reduce background noise levels and to reduce sound transmission between spaces. So our movable wall partition has a STC, a sound transmission coefficient. It was lab tested at 52 and field measured between 48 and 50. And for those architects that are listening to us today, that represents roughly a gypsum board wall. That sound transmission coefficient of 48 is pretty typical. So we're getting great separation between two spaces, and that's why we can have a large room divided into two smaller spaces. So that's a key point. It also allows flexibility within the rooms. This semester we have 15 active learning classrooms, so we divided some rooms in half. Teaching and technology, I like this comparison of the images here. I won't read it verbatim, but I like to note how the students are using the space in these two images. The active learning classroom is on the left. You can see that the tables are using the monitors independently from each other, that they're using the writing surface, that they're collaborating with each other to promote discussion. They've got Post-it notes on their writing surface as well. It's a little small, but it's there in the background. Contrasted to the lecture hall. Each room seats roughly the same. We're in that 120 range for students. If there's technology in the space, it's typically there only for the instructor. The students that bring in their laptops, there's a one-to-one relationship to them. They're not sharing, they're not conversing with each other, and that's pretty typical. It doesn't mean that a lecture hall can't promote engagement between students. It just hinders it where the active learning classroom really promotes interaction between the groups. That was my brief introduction, and I hope there's some questions that we can help answer. Otherwise, I know that we've got a good section on our research as well as how do we actually use the space here today.
Jeremy, this is Jeannie. Let me ask one question to go back to one of your earlier slides. So, studying your institutional audit, you said the review of inventory. So it's not quite, in the past it hadn't been normal for, so you were looking both for if the classroom was technologically fitted, or were you looking for new ways to teach and learn? So what were you looking for when you did that initial inventory?
The initial inventory was looking for new ways to teach and learn and seeing if the technology that we had in the space could be altered in a way to be student-focused. We knew that all of our classrooms, we have 316 on our Twin Cities campus that are general purpose. They all had a basic level of technology where the instructor brings in their laptop, they're able to present with that. There was no interaction for the students to engage with that technology. There was really a demarcation in most of these spaces where you had your instructor zone and your student zone, and rarely did those intermingle. So that was the review of our inventory. We knew we had a base already. Was it the right collection of rooms? Were we meeting all the teaching and learning techniques that were available to faculty? Were we meeting their needs as well?
So you had a pioneering cadre of faculty at the University of Minnesota who were trying new things. So that was an interaction between the three of you and the more of you with people like with Robin?
Absolutely. And Walker comes from a department was the Digital Media Center formerly. And that really engaged faculty on how to teach with technology. So that was a partnership we had previously. And we evolved that to looking into the research and evaluation. So we knew we had a subset that was really dedicated to look at how they're using technology within the learning space. And they wanted to change their curriculum as well. And that's really where Robin's focus was as well, was looking at does the curriculum work within the space.
Jennifer is going to unmute the people on the website. Does anyone have a question, or we'll invite our Minnesota colleagues to continue and spark other questions when JD. Hello?
Hello, this is Spencer. Can you hear me?
Yes, Spencer Benson from the University of Maryland.
Hi,
I'm
Spencer.
here with hi. I'm here with a number of my colleagues, and what I would wonder, and maybe you'll answer it later, how did you ramp up your faculty to be able to use this new space in an efficient manner?
It's a good question. We're still ramping today.
Maybe we can come back to that. I'm going to write that down on my list. Maybe we can come back to that.
And we'll hit it through the next two areas as well.
Mary Lynn, would you have a question?
Hi. Yes, we have a question. It looks like each table has 3 groups, and does each group then have a monitor on the wall and a whiteboard space that's close to each group, even with all these tables across the room?
The tables have 3 groups of 3 students, so that larger pod configuration of 9 has a monitor. And then at the tables, they have a touch panel which allows them to switch which laptop connection is presented to that display. And then there's an associated writing surface per group of 9 students.
Okay, so it's per 9, not per 3.
Correct.
Thank you.
And we have one final question, which again gets to the nature of the community at the University of Minnesota, from Russ Pottle, and I will read it. Do you use the Cooperative Learning Center at the University of Minnesota?
Through the Center for Teaching and Learning, they're another partner in our team here at the University of Minnesota. I know Professor Carl Smith, who is one of the leaders in that area. He knows of the space. He's been touring of it. There are faculty that do use techniques there. Robin uses the team teaching technique in her courses.
Okay. Well, why don't we go on now, and as Robin indicated, you can thread your questions and type your questions in. Jennifer is going to mute now, so we can have a time. I'll mute myself. Bye-bye.
Okay, hi folks, my name is Walker, and as I said before, I work for the Central IT Unit here at Minnesota, conducting research on the effectiveness of digital technology used in learning at the university. And my unit started partnering with the Office of Classroom Management about 5 years ago in 2007 to investigate the impact of the new learning spaces we constructed on campus. And at that time, we only had 2 active learning classrooms. The STSS building that we're in today did not exist. And I think we really had no idea what the impact of these spaces would be on teaching and learning, if there was going to be any impact at all. So we were very much in exploratory mode. And we used student surveys, faculty surveys, interviews, and focus groups to try to get at faculty and student perceptions of what was going on in these spaces, reactions to them, and any problems that they encountered. Overall, the findings that we got were pretty positive, both in terms of the physical layout of the spaces and also the technological configuration within the ALCs. And one of the most common comments that we got from both students and faculty members was that they change the classroom climate. They tend to reduce the psychological distance that tends to exist between faculty members and students, and also among students themselves. And I'll come back to that point a little later on, but that was an interesting finding. So from this point forward, what we wanted to do was conduct more systematic research that would allow us to isolate the impact of these new learning spaces on teaching and learning. So we began a series of comparison studies, of which we have run 3 in total at this point, each of which compared 2 different sections of the same class in terms of student and faculty reactions to the learning spaces that they were in, as well as student learning outcomes. I'm only going to talk about one of those today. I'm going to talk about the most recent of these studies, which was in Biology 1003, which is an introductory biology course for non-majors. This study was conducted in spring of 2011, and it involved 2 sections of Biology 1003, both of which were taught in the STSS building, which Jeremy described for you and which you see pictured on this slide. One of these sections was taught in an ALC here in STSS, and one was taught in one of the more traditionally arranged rooms in STSS. So for this study, we used a quasi-experimental design, which meant that we were able to control between the two sections for a variety of potential confounds. So both sections were taught by the same professor. They were taught using the same syllabus, the same books, the same materials, the same assessments and tests and papers and all of that were used between the two sections, and the same learning activities were conducted in both of these sections. Now, we couldn't assign students randomly to the two sections of the class because this is a live classroom and students just enrolled as students enroll in these things, but we were able to control on the back end for a variety of demographic variables which could potentially confound the results that we found. So, one thing we wanted to find out was, as I said before, we wanted to assess student reactions to the different learning spaces. So we used a survey that we've been using in these rooms for about 5 years at this point, which has been extensively tested and validated to try to get at student responses in terms of their engagement in the learning process, the degree to which the space enriches their learning, and so forth. And you can see the results on this slide. The maroon bars represent the mean response for students in the ALC in this study, and for the comparable section in a traditional room, the gold bars. So students responded pretty positively, and in fact gave significantly more positive reactions to their learning space in terms of engagement, the flexibility of the space, and the fit between the course and the room than students in the traditional section did. They also reported greater enrichment of their learning, though not statistically significantly so. So this was good. This seemed like a good thing. We also mentioned, well, I mentioned just a second ago that we controlled on the back end for demographic features of students. And what that means is that we just compared the two classes, the two groups of students, to make sure they were the same in terms of their gender and their age, their year in school, and a variety of demographic variables that we had on the students. And we found that they were statistically equivalent on all of those measures, except for one. And that measure was their composite ACT scores, which is the most common test that University of Minnesota students take before they enroll. We found a significant 1-point difference between the traditional and the ALC sections of this course, which you can see represented here. Now, it turns out that ACT scores are a pretty good predictor of student performance in introductory level courses like this one, especially for freshmen and sophomores, most of whom these students were. So on the basis of this difference between the two classes, the two sections, excuse me, you would expect students in the traditional classroom to have that they would achieve stronger learning outcomes in the class than students in the ALC section would. And in fact, we generated expected grades for both of the sections of the class based on their ACT scores, and those are represented here in the gold bars. So in essence, you can see that the students in the traditional classroom achieved about what we would expect them to achieve on the basis of their ACT scores. They were just about the same as we would predict on the basis of ACT, whereas students in the ALC sections, outperformed expectations by about 5 percentage points. This was a pretty strong response, and given the controls we had in place for this study, we think this is pretty good evidence that active learning classrooms can increase student academic performance. So the next question, once we've shown this, is how active learning classrooms have the effects that they do. We think there are a number of mechanisms. Oh, and I forgot this slide. So I mentioned that we've run 3 comparison studies, and we found kind of the same thing in each one of them. What we found is students outperforming expectations in terms of their learning outcomes in a post-secondary teaching and learning course, in the biology course I just described, and also in a family social science course. So this is looking like a pattern. We also want to know what the mechanism is by which active learning classrooms have the effects that they do. These spaces are not magical, they're working by means of some mechanism, and we think there are a couple in play. One mechanism we can get at through the observational data that we collected. So in Biology 1003, we observed a randomly selected 50% of the class meetings in both the traditional and the ALC sections of the class. And we used a validated observation protocol basically to record what the professor was doing in both of those sections and to record the frequency of certain learning activities in both of the classes. And some of the results you can see on this slide. The gold bars representing the traditional room, the maroon bars, the ALC room. So different things were happening in the ALC section and the traditional section. You can see that the professor lectured more in the traditional section. There were more student group activities in the ALC section. The professor spent more time at the podium in the traditional section and more time away from the podium in the ALC section, and she spent a lot more time consulting with groups of students in the ALC section. And the interesting thing about these results is that the professor was trying to do the same things in both classes, explicitly making an effort to conduct the same learning activities. In fact, thought she was doing the same things. And then we presented her with these results and said, you know what, actually you were doing different stuff. So I think part of what's going on is that space affects people's behavior, even when they're trying to hold their behavior the same. Space has effects on us. So this is one mechanism. Different stuff is happening in the classrooms, depending on the type of space that it is. Another mechanism, and I want to return at this point to the discussion of our pilot research. And I said there that the most common thing that we found people said about these classrooms is that they changed the classroom climate in noticeable ways. At first we thought that was just an interesting anecdote, but we've come to take that a bit more seriously. We think part of what's going on is that the ALCs do alter the relationships between faculty and students in important ways. There is a body of literature in educational research which suggests that social context is important to teaching and learning. So that the context of the classroom matters a lot to how well students learn, how engaged they are in the process. One important kind of social context is alliance. And this refers to a particular type of relationship between students and faculty members that has the potential to focus student attention, to facilitate engagement in the learning process, and to improve student outcomes. We think another mechanism by which ALCs are having the effects they do is by facilitating alliances. We have, to this date, conducted several dozen, if not hundreds, of interviews and focus groups with students and faculty members. We've delivered thousands of surveys. And the quotations like the ones you see on the slide right here, which I won't read to you, but you can read for yourselves, are pretty representative. What they indicate is that the ALCs are breaking down certain kinds of barriers that exist in traditionally configured classrooms and making people feel close to each other in a way that encourages learning. So we think this is a second kind of mechanism by which ALCs operate. In essence, ALCs are able to increase student engagement and improve student learning outcomes by changing what people do and changing how people relate to each other. So this is just a summary of what we found, and you've seen this slide before. Jeremy went through this. And I want to point just very briefly towards new research that we have coming down the pipe. We have a number of different strands happening right now. One of the more common questions we get about ALCs is, okay, they can have good effects on student learning. What are the best ways to use these spaces? What we're doing right now is conducting a controlled switching panel study with a couple of instructors looking at new innovative teaching techniques to try to determine which are the best ones to use in these spaces, and that's going to be really interesting. We're also working with a chemistry professor who teaches a 350-person intro chem course, and she used to teach it in a huge lecture hall, and what she's trying now is splitting that course into three different sections. Meeting once a week with each of those three sections in our larger ALCs, like this one, which seat 126 kids, and thereby reducing the number of contact hours she has with the students by 2/3. She's having them learn the didactic material online and then using intensive engagement, student-centered learning activities when she does meet with them. So if the student learning outcomes are the same here as they were, or if they're even better than they were in the big lecture hall, this will be an incredible finding in terms of the efficient use of space. We'll have shown that you don't have to meet with students 3 hours a week in a big lecture hall. You can meet with them once a week and use that time more efficiently. So I think that's really going to be interesting. Another common question, maybe the most common one that we get, is really about classroom size. How big can ALCs be? Right. So we've got 126 seating capacity in this room. That's the biggest one we've got. We know that ALCs have an advantage over traditional rooms in terms of things like engagement and enrichment and so forth. Would that advantage hold no matter how big the classroom is, or is there some point at which that advantage will diminish or vanish entirely? We can't tell directly because we don't have any big classrooms to measure, right? All we can do is try to extrapolate from the data that we do have. We're working on that right now by producing probability estimates at different size points along the way, extrapolating the curve that we found already to try to see at what point it will diminish. So this is not ready for prime time yet. There are a lot of things that determine the amount of engagement in a class, but this is where we're going for the future. So, questions?
I'm going to read the many questions we have, starting with this one from Dwight Ferris. on professional development for faculty? Walker?
Yes. What was the question, Jeannie?
Was there a specific focus on professional development for faculty?
My unit wishes that we had better professional development for faculty. We do not have a systematic, we had not had a systematic program for preparing faculty for using these spaces until this semester. We've got one going now. It's just a pilot program, and I wish we were doing better in that regard. We will in the future.
Our center, oh, I'm sorry, Rob, go ahead.
I think that as a faculty person, we started out with one class in these kind of classrooms. It quickly became 2, and now I think we probably have maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 or something. And what the faculty tell us is, finally, I can teach the way I always wanted to. I can watch the lights come on in their eyes. And so it's almost as if it's something we already know how to do. In our labs, at our benches, the interactions we have are familiar to us. And it's just the issue of kind of letting go of the idea that what my job is to lecture and deliver information, to what my job is to get them to discover information, to get them to do things with the stuff that they know.
And we have 2 other non-formal programs. They're formal in their own right, but they're not a requirement to teach in the space. And that's through our Center for Teaching and Learning. They do a couple weeks of instruction for faculty in August, going over active learning principles and techniques. They'll do one-on-one consultations as well. And then within our Office of Information Technology, there's a faculty fellowship program. And while not specifically related to the active learning classrooms, a few of those cohorts that it's a smaller group of up to 8 to 10 individuals. They do a stipend to look at how they change their curriculum for a course and use either different types of technology or different types of learning principles. And then they spend 9 months as a group and then apply it for another 9 months and report back out to a larger faculty community. Those are some examples of how we've done development to this stage. I think we're all excited with Walker and his colleagues developing a more formalized program.
Robin, do you have a comment on that?
Well, the one other thing that we are experimenting with is we think that simply observing the classroom makes a huge difference, because when you think initially of how the heck am I going to teach in a room like this, where am I going to stand, if you just watch it in action a couple of times, it seems not so strange. And so we have an open classroom. People come and visit from all over. And that's kind of how we're starting to mentor postdocs and new faculty, is to have them, give them a teaching assignment that initially is just be there and watch and kind of be the super TA for the group, interact with the students, but start to feel comfortable. And it's pretty interesting how quickly people become comfortable with asking instead of telling. I think that's kind of the bottom line.
Yeah,
I think that resonates with what Brenda Farmer spoke about from Berkeley, too, where people walk into a room and say, oh, this is different. I might be able to do things differently here. We have a whole set of questions just on the technologies in the furniture, the screen size for the LCD, do students bring their own, what's the bandwidth for when they bring their own devices, why did you have round tables, why did you choose 9 people?
All good questions. The image height, these monitors are a 50-inch monitor, and that's to give us an image height that allows the most distant student to be 6 times that image height. So if that image height is 30 inches, it allows the students to be about 12 to 16 feet away from that screen. The round tables, we were intent on providing furniture that we didn't previously have in our inventory. And a round table format is different. It means that the focus is on the students, that there's no one person here at the table that's necessarily leading the discussion, that I'm able to visit with all of my peers at the table, and I'm able to interact with them. So the tables are 7 foot in diameter. That means I'm not too distant from the farthest person away.
Yeah, and I think also we took the research out of Bob Buechner's scale-up rooms to heart in the design as well, and simply trusted that learning physics wasn't that different from learning other things, and that we have the same kind of outcomes.
Yeah. We are looking at a different table design for a professional school, the School of Pharmacy, College of Pharmacy. They would like more of an extended D shape, if you can think of that, where the curve is extended out, and that is intent to give someone in a leadership role to be at the head of the table and to lead the conversation, the discussion. So they're looking at providing that. The tables, we're in-house. I have a support unit that does the technology design, installation, and maintenance. They're AMX programmers, so they designed the room system to be interactive for the students. That means that they don't have to go to an instructor console to interact with the technology. They can come down to the student table. There's 3 laptop connections, 1 connection per group of 3 students. They can turn on the display at the student table and start working at it. We do that because we also invite students to use this space as well as other classrooms as study space when they are not scheduled for activity. So they're open regular hours, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. If it's not scheduled for an activity, we have a room display outside of each room that shows the activity for that day. They can go in and use the space without scheduling it. It's open study space. Bringing your own device, we have that capability because it's just a laptop connection at the table. We also have, half the rooms have laptop carts where instructors can bring in the cart and have the students all have the same piece of hardware. We're also piloting this semester an Apple TV device in 3 of our active learning classrooms that allow the instructor to remotely connect with an iOS device or a Mac OS device. And they're using that to roam around the space and then wirelessly project in the room. And that's intriguing because we're taking a consumer piece of hardware and as an institution trying to make it commercial in its application. In the sense that can we remotely support it across a broad spectrum of classrooms? So right now we have 6 general purpose classrooms and about 20 other departmental conference rooms with these devices that we're on the network and managing remotely.
I have 2 more questions, and I'm going to ask Mary Lynn to put her question in when...
Jeannie, this is Robin. I would like to speak to the idea of your own device versus versus a provided device. There are times when we really don't want students to use their own devices because the minute they have their personal computer in front of them, they're not interacting. So we allow it for some of the class meetings, but in many of them, we force them to use what I call a neutral computer that doesn't have their email on it, it doesn't have all the other things, distractions.
Okay, Robin, while you're on then, one of the questions was how do you administer exams?
Well, it's interesting. We give in-class exams in some courses and quizzes, and we also do take-home exams. So it's really no different than being in a lecture theater. In some cases, we'll have students, if they choose to, or if the faculty want to, they'll put up a manila folder kind of as a shield, you know, a privacy shield. But we haven't seen any difference in terms of looking on other people's papers. In fact, I think we could detect it more easily because we're down in amongst the students rather than having them back in the middle of a room.
Some of these continuing questions deal with, I think, questions directly to Robin, and so why don't we turn to Robin now and listen to her story, and then we'll postpone the questions and find some more questions. Robin, it's yours.
Control the machine. You know, the first thing that, let's see, the first thing that I want to do, I want to echo what Walker was saying because I'm really glad that there's evidence that student learning improves, but in reality, so long as it wasn't worse, I didn't care because the relationship that I now have with students is so much richer and so much more rewarding that so long as it didn't hurt their learning, I was perfectly happy with that. what I think that I would like to do is talk just a little bit. We've been now teaching this course for 6 years. This is the 6th year. And so we have quite a lot of experience at it. And I'd like to go back and kind of give you an idea of what was the philosophy of course design. And we were so lucky that it just dovetailed right with what Jeremy was doing with the active learning classroom. But then maybe give some examples, and I'll try to save lots of time for questions. And before I finish, I also want to say that we have a completely open door policy in this classroom. We write it into the syllabus. Anyone is welcome to come visit. Students can bring visitors if they want. And the only rule we have is that you have to introduce yourself to the class and tell them why you're there. So the three major things that we wanted to do in this class, it was a new class for biological sciences majors. It was about 2.5 years in the planning stages, so lots and lots of faculty talking about what did they really want for the students. And one of the goals was to apply what we know about how people learn, focus on higher order skills. It's not about the content. Content is necessary. Content is important, but content was just the starting point. And finally, to represent as authentically as we possibly could the work of biologists, what biologists actually do. So I would say those are the themes. So I'd real briefly, this is just a very brief synopsis of the kinds of things we talk with students and others and what we considered. But the bottom line is, what does it mean to learn something? And there are several, of course, definitions you can come up with. From a psychological perspective, you might say that it's the ability to use something after a significant period of disuse. That is, you remember something long enough. It's not whether you remember it after the test is over, but after the semester is over, and the ability to apply it to a new problem. In biology, what's really fascinating and amazing is, of course, that when you learn something, your brain is physically different than before. And so what we think of, that's one of the reasons it's so hard to learn. But when we think about what it's teaching, the partner to learning, we think about our job in a different way. It's more not as the deliverer of content, because there's many ways that students can get that, but it's more about, can we create an architecture in which students will engage with the material and learn the things we want them to learn or we need for them to learn. So how can we design an experience that would promote the kind of brain change that we would like to see in our students? So there's lots that's known about learning. I would point to these books as some of the ones that help to guide us. But when all is said and done, there are a number of principles that we try to apply in our design in the classroom. First of all, every single brain is unique, and therefore what works for one doesn't necessarily work for the other. So we do lots of varieties of activities. There's lots of chances for students to try and fail and try again. What I pay attention to is what I learn, and that ability to focus, I think, is very challenging for students these days. And so we try to design activities that will hold their attention and be for extended periods of time. The more senses that we engage, the more learning happens. So in the class, we use a lot of manipulables, moving around, writing on the whiteboard. The person who does the work does the learning. I remember when I first was starting to teach, I did all the work. I made the best lectures on the planet, at least I thought that was the case. And then I'd give students the exam, and they hadn't learned anything. And so instead of creating the great lecture, we create opportunities for students to work really, really hard. Making memories requires repetition, elaboration, and sleep. And that is, throughout the class, we are coming back to material, and they're having to use it again in a different context. They have to put things in their own words, which is what elaboration means. And sleep. And this is one of our framing principles. My colleague Mark Decker and I give take-home exams, and we believe in them strenuously, and I'm sure you're going to have some questions about cheating and all kinds of things I'd be happy to address. But that's the only thing that I can envision that gives students a problem and allows them to sleep on it and let their unconscious work on it and come back. The brain is social, and so the tables make a social environment. The students are stuck with a team of 8 other students the whole semester long. That group begins to forge really close relationships and support one another. And finally, we promote a lot of metacognition and reflection throughout the entire class. So these are kind of the principles that we try to apply. We start every class with this question. And I've asked this question from many of my colleagues. I've asked it from many, many people. And believe it or not, we all come up with the same answers. This is what my students say. Let's see. Oh, somehow my writing went away. So Jeannie, somehow in the thing. So what students say is the same thing we say. They say, we want to be able to solve problems. We want to think critically. They do say, I want to get a job, but they want to communicate effectively. So students have the same goals that we do. And then we ask them, well, where should that happen? And we tell them that's going to happen here. We're going to be focusing on higher order skills. And if you look at this, I'll remind those of you who don't know this, this is Bloom's taxonomy of cognition. What we do is we buy time to do the hard stuff in class by offloading the lower two levels of Bloom's onto students' shoulders at home. So we do not lecture on basic information. We give study guides to students, and practice quizzes, and it's on their own shoulders to learn the definitions of things, the basic information. And then they walk in on Monday morning and there's a quiz on it holding them accountable for that information. And so what we do in class is we focus on how to apply the information that they know, how to analyze data, and how to use the things that they know to create something new, which is probably one of the biggest surprises for me. You would absolutely not believe what a freshman can think of. Startlingly amazing things that, there's one group in our class right now that has a really good idea for perhaps developing treatments for Alzheimer's disease. I mean, really a really good idea. So we've got them all the way up at the pinnacle of Bloom's taxonomy. So back to the themes: apply the biology of learning, focus on higher order skills, and represent the authentic work of biologists are the themes. So let's see. So I think what I'm going to do is skip through. These are things that we show students in class. We talk about how this class is different. We tell them that they're going to go through a grieving process, which when we initially started teaching, we didn't do that. We didn't help coach the students through the idea that they can come to this room and be passive. And so now we talk about grief. We hope that they get to the anger stage at least, and most of them do, and most of them get over it. But anyway, yeah, it's really true. So this is kind of the map. We have learning outcomes, the biology concepts. Our students learn on their own the basic information, and then we use those concepts to do critical thinking, communication skills, teamwork skills, higher order skills, et cetera. And the activities that we do are divided. I would say that, in fact, I think I'll go to the next slide. We have a couple pictures. All right, you've seen everything. Okay, so here's how the week goes. First of all, we like to meet for longer periods of time. Rather than a 50-minute class period, we like having 2-hour blocks of time, and that gives us time to really wrestle with problems at length. So, and the class that I'm going to talk about meets 3 times a week for 2 hours. And I know you're breathing in really hard right at that, but this is a class for biology majors and our foundational class, and we think students get a lot out of it. So on Monday, there are quizzes on the material that were assigned from the study guide. And then we spend about an hour in application and analysis activities. This could be anything from reading a problem and for example, there might be a case study on genetic engineering. They might have to design or analyze a gene sequence. They might do a simulation of evolution. They might watch a short video and critique it to talk about what things were wrong with the video. So it really depends on the faculty member of what the activities are, but they're quite varied. On Wednesday, we complete the application and analysis activities, and then there's a long-term project that is our synthesis and evaluation activity. The project in this class that students work on through the semester is to identify a problem of social value and solve it using genes. The 2 themes of the course content are evolution and genetics. And so they work on these projects on part of Wednesday and then all of Friday. we work in time every day for metacognition, and if we didn't do that, the students would not think about their own learning, and we think that's really important. So we climb the Bloom's ladder, the Bloom's pyramid, by these preparation that they do outside of class at the low-level Blooms, these application and analysis activities that we do in class, again, run the gamut. You can envision the kinds of things this would be. They're on the floor working out tables of comparing and contrasting cells. It's really fun, really exciting, and quite varied. And then the higher order things are these projects. I've just illustrated one. This team came up with the idea of creating living camouflage clothing using squid genes. So that gives you an idea of where they can go. So I'd say that the general philosophy that we have is these are biology majors, and we're going to put them, it's not a biology appreciation class. It's a class for working biology, learning how to do biology. And so our philosophy is to put the students in the canoe and send them down the, we teach them how to climb back in when they fall out. But the idea is to get them on the river and help them go to places we can't even envision. So I'll stop there and be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Robin. That was absolutely wonderful.
Well, come visit.
I was with Walker and Jeremy, and you weren't there, but we shared ideas about this before. The colleagues on the webinar are unmuted. Do we have any particular question that from John? I kind of short-circuited your question earlier. Would you like to speak about the involvement of students, John McDermott?
Hi, Jeannie. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. There are actually 5 of us here at Penn. John is not here. We're pretending to be him. And Paul Heine, one of our physics professors, is here, and he had a question about the study that was shown earlier.
Yeah, the question was, when the students signed up for their sections, did they know which section they were going to sign up for so that they might have picked the one with a different style, and could there have been some self-selection among the students because of that?
Well, that's a good question. I can address that. And the answer is no, they did not know. They did not know in which type of classroom their section was going to be held. And actually, students for the 1003 course sign up by initially signing up for their lab section, and they're then sorted into sections. So they didn't even know which one they were going to end up at all. So we don't think there was any self-selection on that basis.
Thank you.
Do you have time for a follow-up question from us?
Yes, Anoop?
Yes. Hi, Jeannie. I had a question. I like this idea that the classroom becomes study space after hours, because I think our lecture halls are largely useless outside hours. The students are not really going to go into a lecture hall to work collaboratively. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about whether that made it easier for you to make a campaign on campus in terms of space usage.
Absolutely. My first experience with that came with the pilot project. 6 weeks into a semester, as you know, if you go into a lecture hall, there's very few students at all in there, especially if there's an hour break of time between courses. So I went into one of the pilot rooms. There was an hour and a half break between 2 course sections. And what I found was 5 tables of students, pretty much full, 8 to 9 students at each table, working in there from engineering, computer science, history of medicine. They weren't only working as groups with themselves, but they were throwing ideas across the room to each other. No instructor-led idea of the concept, student-led, student-focused through study time. And that was when I knew we were onto something. And it definitely helped in trying to convey the message of how the space changes students' use of it. They really take ownership of the space. It really becomes their space. So if it's their space, let's open it up to them as much as possible.
That's what I think. If you're going to invest money into a new classroom, I think it's very compelling to use this style of classrooms, whether you teach differently or not, frankly. These classrooms are used for all kinds of things. They're used for workshops. They're used for student clubs. They're used for recruiting. This is like a huge recruiting tool that we have right here. They are used all the time. In fact, I wish they were used a little less well because I can't schedule some events that I would like to in them.
Jeremy, Walker, I'm sorry, I'll get this right yet. Walker, talk a little bit more about the engagement of students, your conversations with students. That seems to be such a compelling part of your story.
Anything in particular you're wondering about, Jeannie?
So just, do they like to talk to you about the spaces? Is there now a history after 6 years that they know that they're contributing to the evolution of learning spaces at the university?
Well, that's interesting that you should mention that, because we've now had active learning classrooms for a number of years, and a significant number of students pass through these classrooms every semester. And over the course of an academic year, something like 36% of unique degree-seeking undergraduates will have at least one course in an ALC in the SDSS building. And so that speaks to the ubiquity of these things. At first, they were a niche phenomenon, and now they aren't anymore. And one thing we want to do is track the evolution of student attitudes and responses as these become a normalized part of their experience at the university.
You know, I will say that a lot of the students who are in my class this semester, in fact, are taking other classes in the same room, and they are noting, it's kind of like, I don't know if many of us remember when PowerPoint first came around and digital projectors, and then the students started fussing because they wanted PowerPoint or whatever. The students will say, well, they don't use the technology like you guys do. You know, my other class doesn't. So I'm starting to think that there'll be pressure from the students to really help faculty maybe embrace more use of you know, she was saying that they were telling her how to do a web search instead of just letting them do a web search, was an example. And so I think that there will be pressure from students in that regard too.
Spencer, do you have a question you'd like to speak up?
Yes, can you hear me, Jeannie?
Sure thing, go ahead.
One of the questions we have here, if you can comment on it, I know, Robin, I know that you're a big fan and you're very effective at using group work in it. The question is, how essential is the idea of group project work to the ALC, and what other types of pedagogies are being used in non-STEM classes?
Well, this building is called the Science Teaching and Student Services building, so a lot of the classes are science. But I think that I am so, Walker's study is so compelling to me that if all you do is put a person in this room, they will do things differently, and the students will be more engaged. So even, I don't think you have to do anything different. They form an automatic group because they're sitting there looking at each other, but you don't have to put them into groups specially like we do. You don't have to have them work on projects in particular. It kind of happens automatically because they're there, but I think you don't have to plan for it even.
And I'll just add, going back to how Jeannie started the conversation today about community. So one of the courses that uses an ALC is a Spanish course, and they use the room to create those types of communities at the tables, and then use the writing service to do mind mapping. And then they can take that mind mapping and digitally present it across the room using the laptops and try to retain what they have in the room and see when they come back to it, are they keeping the principles alive within the space. So that's a non-scientific use of space, even though it has some scientific use of the space through a Spanish foreign language course.
And I'll just chime in on this question as well, because, and I'd like to follow up on something that Robin said, which is that in our work with faculty, we discovered that when faculty walk into this type of room, that they're immediately struck by how different it is and how it calls for a different type of pedagogy. It feels awkward and weird just to stand up and lecture, I think in part because there's no single point of focus in the room. There's no one point in the room to which all eyes are drawn, as there is in a lecture hall. And we've also discovered in another of the 3 comparison studies, which I didn't talk about, that if you teach an ALC with a largely lecture-focused pedagogy, and you teach the same class with a more student-centered active learning pedagogy, you're going to get better results through the active learning student-centered pedagogy, and we have found that.
I also like the research that we haven't talked about today, but students' view of this space. They view it as infinitely flexible. That comes with either using the space as it is, the furniture, the technology. But from their perspective, how the space is used is limitless. So it really comes then back to how the instructor wants to use the space. And really that's the only limit right now from the student's perspective.
I would like to, if possible, also to how it's changed me as a teacher, because the screens in particular, watch how students, for example, how they're doing web searches, and it's opening. I think that it gives you a picture of what they do when they're by themselves in their dorm rooms and how they're approaching problems. And so it's helped me understand where the big lapses are in what they know how to do and where they actually know a lot more than I was giving them credit for before.
Robin, there's a question here about group dynamics. Does everyone come prepared after sleeping over the weekend? And how do different people in the group pull their weight in a flipped classroom?
Well, there are 2 things that we do that I think are really powerful. The first is that on Monday morning, you take your individual quiz, and then the team retakes exactly the same quiz for 1/3 additional points. So instantly, if you're showing up not prepared, everybody in your team knows you're not prepared, and that's more pressure than it would be for us knowing that they're not prepared. So I think that that's important. The other thing is we have a rather interesting system of checks and balances about grading. So they give the students are peer evaluating each other's teamwork skills, not the quality of their work. And they do it several times in the semester, and some of the grade, 2.5% of the grade depends on the quality of their feedback to their peers, and 2.5% depends on the feedback itself of their contributions to the team. So we're able to keep people pretty honest by using the grade structure to reinforce how important these skills are.
Well, do we have any, let's see, we've muted the colleagues, and I'm seeing if there's any other questions here that I've missed. And I will say, as I do at the end of the LSC webinars, thank you very much, but I'm going back to kind of theories of change and how we're at a point in the evolution of learning spaces in undergraduate colleges and universities that so many people are doing so many interesting things that no longer does each individual campus have to reinvent things for themselves. And one of the theories of change that I've personally like a lot is finding the outliers and find what worked for them. And so I think we appreciate spotlighting the work of the outlier, the University of Minnesota. And I think no matter what size the institute is, the opportunity to start with the questions that you asked, you know, how are your students learning now, where are their students learning, what are their students learning, is a good beginning point for campuses of all sizes, of all missions, and in all contexts. And so the 3 of you and your colleagues have set a pretty high bar for the larger community. And we thank you again, and we'll remind the people on the call that they have access to the audio and video of this webinar. And so I will say thank you very much, Jeremy, Walker, and Robin. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Hi, can you guys hear me?